Imagine you could stand in the middle of a town, stone houses on every side, streets laid out in precise grids, a temple at the center, grain storage still intact, and know with certainty that every single person who lived there vanished. Not one by one, not over a decade. All of them. In a single night. Now imagine that happened to 84 towns at once. And then imagine the government of India eventually came along, declared the land a protected heritage site, opened it to tourists, installed informational signs, and still made it officially illegal to be there after dark. That is Kuldhara. And after 200 years, no one has offered an explanation that actually holds up to scrutiny. The village sits about 18 kilometers southwest of Jaisalmer, in the western reaches of Rajasthan, in the heart of the Thar Desert, one of the most hostile living environments on Earth. Rainfall here averages less than 100 millimeters a year. In the worst years, it barely registers at all. The summer heat routinely exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. There are no rivers. No natural lakes. Just sand, rock, wind, and a horizon that looks the same in every direction. And yet, for more than 500 years, a civilization thrived here. The Paliwal Brahmins arrived in this part of the Thar in the late 13th century, around 1291, driven west from their original home in Pali after years of conflict with neighboring powers. They settled Kuldhara as their principal village and spread across 83 surrounding settlements, an interlocking network of communities spread across the desert, each one connected by trade, by kinship, and by a system of shared governance called the Lok Panchayat. Within a few generations, they had done something that should have been impossible. They had turned one of India's most arid regions into one of its most profitable. The secret was an engineering system called the cordon. A cordon is, at its simplest, a long earthen embankment built across a gently sloping desert plain. When the monsoon rains arrive, brief and unpredictable as they are, the embankment catches the runoff from a much larger catchment area, flooding the lower field and saturating the soil. As the water slowly recedes over the following weeks, it leaves behind moisture deep in the earth, enough to grow a full winter crop of wheat, mustard, and chickpea through the dry season on nothing but stored groundwater. The Paliwals didn't just build one of these. They built hundreds, linking catchments together in integrated networks that could produce crops even in years of almost no rainfall at all. Agricultural scientists studying the cordon system today have found it raises groundwater levels downstream by up to 2 meters annually. A peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of the International Society for Horticultural Science identified more than 500 cordon structures still occupying over 28,000 hectares across the Jaisalmer district, engineering built by a community that had been gone for 2 centuries. And this is the part that the legend tends to skip past, because it matters enormously. These were not desperate subsistence farmers scraping a living from the sand. The Paliwal Brahmins were one of the wealthiest communities in all of Rajasthan. They were bankers as well as farmers. Their trading network stretched east across all of India and west into Sindh, Baluchistan, Afghanistan, and reportedly as far as Java and Sumatra. A British officer writing in the early 19th century noted that even the Maharawal, the king of Jaisalmer himself, took loans from Paliwal bankers. The king of a prosperous desert fortress was in debt to his own subjects. So the question that sits at the center of the Kuldhara mystery is not simply, where did they go? The question is, why would a community of this sophistication, this wealth, this deep-rooted infrastructure, walk away from everything they had built, every embankment, every well, every stone house, every grain store, and never come back? Here is where the historical record starts to become genuinely strange. In 1815, a British officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Tod was traveling through the Jaisalmer region, documenting the geography and politics of Rajputana for the East India Company. Tod was meticulous. His account, eventually published as Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, remains one of the most important primary sources for the history of this region. When he passed through the Kuldhara area, he counted approximately 800 residents living in around 200 households. 800 people. In 1815. The traditional legend says the entire community vanished in a single night, around 1825. That is 10 years after Tod found 800 people living there. Other historical records suggest some stragglers were documented in the area as late as 1890. So the story of a sudden, overnight disappearance in 1825, clean and dramatic as it sounds, does not perfectly fit the population data we actually have. What the data suggests instead is something more complicated and, in its own way, more disturbing: a prolonged collapse. A slow unraveling. A community that began hemorrhaging people and never stopped, until there was no one left. The question is, what caused it? 3 explanations have been proposed over the past 2 centuries, and none of them is wholly satisfying. The first is the legend most people know. The second is the explanation that academics tend to prefer. And the third is the one that almost nobody talks about, even though the evidence for it may be the strongest of all. The legend goes like this. At some point in the early 19th century, the Diwan of Jaisalmer, the prime minister, was a man named Salim Singh. Salim Singh was not a fictional villain. He was a historical figure whose elaborate haveli, his multi-storied mansion, still stands in the old city of Jaisalmer today. You can visit it. And by every account that survives from his era, he was genuinely feared. James Tod himself, the same British officer who counted those 800 Paliwal residents, described Salim Singh in terms that leave little room for interpretation. Writing about the state of Jaisalmer under his administration, Tod described the Diwan as a rapacious monster, and noted that the Paliwal community, amounting to thousands of families, were nearly all in voluntary exile. Agriculture, Tod wrote, had almost ceased. Commerce had ceased through want of security. The sole revenue of the state, he observed, arose from confiscation. This is not legend. This is a contemporary British military officer documenting what he witnessed. The legend adds a more personal dimension. It says that Salim Singh became fixated on the daughter of the chief of Kuldhara, that he demanded she be given to him, and threatened the entire community with ruinous taxation and violence if they refused. Rather than surrender their daughter and their dignity, the Paliwal elders called a council. Every village leader was summoned. In the darkness, a decision was made. Before dawn, the villages emptied. Silently, without a word to anyone, tens of thousands of people slipped into the desert and did not stop. Before they left, according to every version of the story, they cursed the land. They declared that no one would ever successfully settle Kuldhara again. That anyone who tried would be driven out. The second explanation is more prosaic but harder to dismiss. By 1815, remember, the year Tod counted 800 people, many of the wells at Kuldhara had already gone dry. The water table in this part of the Thar had been declining for decades, likely a consequence of a longer regional drought cycle. The cotton system was brilliantly engineered, but it was engineered for a specific hydrological regime. If the underlying aquifer drops far enough, even the best runoff harvesting system in the world cannot compensate. The land that had been the source of Paliwal prosperity was, literally, running out of the resource on which all of it depended. Under this theory, the departure was not a dramatic act of collective resistance. It was an economic retreat, slow, grinding, inevitable. Families leaving one by one as their wells failed, their crops failed, their reason to stay evaporated along with the groundwater. The third explanation is the one least discussed. Historical records from the early 19th century note seismic activity in the Jaisalmer region, earthquakes of sufficient magnitude to damage structures and destabilize foundations. A community whose entire agricultural system depended on precisely engineered earthworks would have been especially vulnerable to ground movement that cracked embankments, shifted drainage patterns, destroyed wells. A single significant earthquake could have unraveled decades of hydrological infrastructure overnight. Not the people disappearing overnight, but the system they depended on, collapsing in hours. Now, here is the thing about all 3 explanations. They are not mutually exclusive. And the actual historical record, when you read it carefully, when you sit with the data Tod left behind and the well-drying records and the seismic accounts, points towards something more plausible than any single dramatic cause. The Paliwal departure was most likely a multi-decade collapse that accelerated under compounding pressures. The wells were failing. The taxes were crushing. The political protection of the Jaisalmer court, which had historically allowed them to operate with relative autonomy, had been replaced by the predatory administration of a man who regarded their accumulated wealth as a resource to be extracted. When you are already stressed by water scarcity and watching your agricultural system deteriorate, and the political situation turns actively hostile, the decision to leave is not dramatic. It is rational. And a community with the organizational sophistication of the Paliwals, a community that had coordinated water management across 84 villages for centuries, was more than capable of coordinating a mass departure across those same 84 villages simultaneously. The overnight quality of the story is not necessarily myth. It is more likely that the final exodus was deliberate and coordinated, that the decision was made collectively, the departure was silent and swift, and the communities that had taken decades to hollow out were emptied in their final act in the space of a night or two. Not magic. Logistics. What no one can explain is what happened after. For 200 years, the land has sat empty. Various attempts to resettle Kuldhara have reportedly ended in failure, the settlers leaving, citing unease, strange sounds at night, an atmosphere that resists habitation. The Indian Paranormal Society sent a team of 30 investigators to spend the night there. They reportedly heard unexplained sounds. They did not stay. The Rajasthan Tourism Board, for its part, officially promotes Kuldhara as one of India's most haunted locations, and simultaneously closes the gates at sunset. Every day, tourists arrive. Every day, they leave before dark. The Archaeological Survey of India has declared Kuldhara a protected monument. The Rajasthan government has built a small museum near the entrance, installed signs along the lanes, paved the access road. The site generates tourism revenue. And yet the designation of protection that prevents it from being demolished also prevents it from being lived in. The Indian state, officially, owns a village that the Indian state officially treats as uninhabitable after dark. That is a specific, strange kind of irony. A government that does not believe in curses has, through its own regulations, come to enforce one. Stand inside Kuldhara today and what you actually see is not the ruins of a failed community. The stone houses are deteriorating, yes, but the layout of the town is deliberate and sophisticated. 3 longitudinal roads cut through precise east-west lanes. A mother goddess temple at the center. The remnants of cotton embankments visible in the land around the village. This was not a collection of mud huts. This was a designed city in the desert, built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And they left it, completely, without leaving a note. No inscription explaining their reasons. No written record of the council meeting where the decision was made. No account of where they went or how they dispersed. A community that kept meticulous financial records, that managed complex irrigation networks, that maintained trade relationships across half of Asia, left no written explanation for the most consequential decision they ever made. That silence is the most revealing thing about Kuldhara. Because the Paliwals were not people who left things undocumented by accident. If they left no explanation, it is reasonable to suspect they did not want to leave one. The silence was itself a message, to Salim Singh, to the court of Jaisalmer, to anyone who came looking. We were here. We built this. We are leaving. And we are not telling you where we went. Their curse was not supernatural. It was sociological. A community powerful enough to make a desert bloom had decided, collectively, that the desert was preferable to what was being asked of them. And the land, drained, depleted, stripped of the agricultural genius that had made it productive, could not sustain whoever came after. 200 years on, the wells are still dry. The embankments are crumbling. The grain stores are empty. And the gates close at sunset, every evening, because somewhere in the bureaucratic memory of the Rajasthan government, someone understood that there is something about this particular silence that should be respected. The Paliwals did not vanish. They chose to disappear. And in a world that tends to record the stories of those who win, Kuldhara is one of the rare places where the people who walked away left the loudest mark of all, a mark that is still here, still studied, still visited, and still, officially, impossible to ignore after dark. There are places in the world where the absence of people speaks louder than their presence ever did. Kuldhara is one of them, a reminder that the most profound human statements are sometimes made not by what is built, but by what is left behind in perfect, deliberate, enduring silence.